This, unfortunately, is the second take because the microphone was not set up properly, and that is my fault. Anyways, so this week's episode is going to be over something dark and disturbing, as most of our stuff is, but this one, for some reason, feels a little bit darker, more disturbing than usual. And this one is over serial killers. Yeah, that's just its own subject in itself. I believe I covered about 5 different serial killers in this episode. But before we begin, let's start off with our usual small talk and our call to action. Our usual call to action is going to be like, follow, subscribe everywhere, including YouTube, TikTok, and even the metaverse. I know not a lot of people want to go there, but I'm there just in case. I'm also Lemonade, but you already know with the past that's happened so far, Lemonade disappeared too. So yeah, it's up to y'all. That's going to be more just everyday pictures, vlog style stuff. But let's begin. So, oh yes, and also separate call to action. If you see the dreaded white and green trucks around town, especially in Texas or on the southern states, please let your fellow Hispanics know. That way they can hide, run, get away, because we are all one people and we should not be persecuted this way. I hate to say it, but even though me being an American citizen, it has been documented that even citizens have been deported. So, anyone with dark skin, brown skin, Hispanic, Latino, Afro-Latino, whatever you consider yourself, please be careful because they're just rounding up anyone that looks like us. So let's get on with this. That's dark. That's like personal life that's going downhill to like a dark subject matter. So it's just a dark episode today. This week on the Spooky Mysteries, we'll discuss a few of Mexico's most notorious serial killers, including one that was supposedly the inspiration for Hannibal Lecter. Before we get into that, one of the heaviest subjects I've covered, let's talk about the news. Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, says that LA and Mexico firefighters are brothers, even after what Trump has said. Because everything that's happened, Mexico sent its own firefighters. They easily just sent as many as they could to help with the fires in LA that are still, if I'm not mistaken, going on. They've somewhat been contained, but they're still going on. I believe within the past week, there have been more flare-ups, but they're trying to get it contained. On the lighter side, monarch butterflies have finished their latest migration to Mexico. A little late in the year this time, but they made it. There's a guide on mexiconews.com that helps foreigners walk on the sidewalks. I thought that was a funny little article, but then I realized that people that have not been to Mexico would have trouble navigating the random tall sidewalks that are there. So because the sidewalks go from like this tall to tall enough for 4 people wide, and they go from like 6 inches off the ground to about 2 feet off the ground. So if you're not used to it, yeah, you're going to fall and hurt yourself really bad. Well, with that being said, let's begin with the topic at hand, serial killers of Mexico. Let's start off with the railway killer, Arturo Maturino Resendiz, with a suspected 23 murders to his name. Ranging everywhere from the U.S. to Mexico, he's traveled everywhere from Canada, U.S., and Mexico. He received his name due to most of his crimes taking place on or near railways. His reputation managed to get him on the FBI's top 10 most wanted for a little bit of time. Not much is known about his early life. A lot of stuff that has to do with Mexico, their early lives are very difficult to come by just because it's not well documented. Other than where he was born and his original name, he was born in Matamoros and his legal name was Ángel Leoncio Reyes Resendiz. He changed it to his stepfather's and his mother's name. This was a dangerous man. He would go from Mexico, USA, and Canada on the railway system just to evade authorities. And he did this for a good amount of time before being caught. He had been deported about 4 times since 1973, totaling 15 kills. I know it's supposedly more than that, but what's been accredited to him is 15, guaranteed. His main weapons were rocks, a pickaxe, or anything that was blunt and heavy. Though his moniker was the railway killer or the rail car killer, most of his crimes happened at the homes of his victims. Like I said, they were nearby. They weren't directly on the railway system. They were close enough to where he could go, do what he had to do, jump on the railway, and take off again. They happened at the homes of his victims. After he murdered his victims, he would just stay there for a while to eat their food and to take his time choosing what he was going to steal. He would lay out their IDs and personal information to get to learn about them, to get to know who he had just murdered. The items he stole were gifted to his mother and his wife, who lived in Durango. He would at times rape some of his female victims, but this was not the primary reason for his attacks. It was if he was able to overpower him, he would do it. If not, that wasn't his primary attack. When he surrendered, his mother and wife returned whatever jewelry they still had to the victims' families. So whatever they were gifted and they realized how they were given to them, they'd be like, you know what? These are not ours. They belong to y'all. Take them. We don't want them. But a lot of times they would have already been scrapped, melted down, sold, whatever, right? He would leave his victims covered with a blanket or obscured in some way out of sight. So that also leads to the psychological. He didn't like to see what he had done. I'm going to go over a few of his victims that range from Jane and John Does to families. In 1986 was the first known victim, a Jane Doe, was found in Bexar County, San Antonio. He had met her at a homeless shelter where he talked her into taking a ride to an abandoned farmhouse, where they were going to do some target practice. Sometime during their supposed target practice, she had disrespected him. That's when he turned a .38 caliber gun on her and shot her 4 times and killed her. She was then found on the 23rd of March in 1986. The next person was killed in the same year. This next victim is also a John. This one is a John Doe, but they're also a Doe. He was supposedly the boyfriend of the previous victim. Not much is known about this person, only what the railway killer has said, which is that he killed him due to being a practitioner of dark magic. His body is supposedly in a creek somewhere between San Antonio and Uvalde. He was never found. We're going to skip ahead a few years to 1997, where he killed Jesse Howell and his fiancée, Wendy Hubin, aged 19 and 16. The young couple had met Resendiz while trying to find work in Florida picking oranges. They had jumped onto a rail car that was occupied by Resendiz. He had beaten Jesse to death with an air brake hose from the rail car, then proceeded to rape and suffocate her, his fiancée, with his bare hands and with duct tape. So he bound her mouth and nose and then choked her out, killed her. His reasons for these murders were because they were anti-Christian. The next couple on the list, one of them is believed to be the only survivor of his attacks. Christopher Mayer and his girlfriend, Holly Dunn, had the unfortunate fate of meeting him on his turf, a rail track, the railroads. They had been at a party earlier in that night when they had decided to go for a walk and get some fresh air. They had wandered along the nearby rail tracks where they just chatted and had a good time for about an hour. Later that night, their lives would change forever. As they were about to leave, a man suddenly appeared from behind an electrical box and demanded money while wielding what appeared to be an ice pick. Before the young couple could react, he held the weapon to Chris's neck, and they had told Resendiz that they had no money and to take their credit cards instead. Unhappy with this, he proceeded to tie them up and throw their bodies into a ditch that ran alongside the tracks. Resendiz returned to the tracks as if to see if anyone was nearby or if anyone had seen what he had done. In this time, Holly had managed to free her hands and take the gag out of her mouth, and that's when he returned with a huge rock and just let it fall on Chris's head, killing him. When it fell and landed on his head, Chris's fiancée, Holly, had screamed at Resendiz to tilt his head to the side or he would drown on his own blood and die. But all he did was look at her and said, "He's already dead." Then Resendiz turned his attention to Holly. Upon realizing what was about to happen, she kicked and screamed and pleaded for her life. That's when he stabbed her in the neck with an ice pick and proceeded to rape her. After he was done, she begged him to put her pants back on so that when her body was found, she was not naked. For some reason, he did as she requested, and he proceeded to beat her with a plank of wood, and that's when she lost consciousness. When she eventually came to, he was nowhere to be seen. Bloodied and beaten, she found the strength to survive and made it to a stranger's home, where she was taken to the hospital with a broken jaw and a 1-inch stab wound in her neck and cuts and bruises all over her body. It took about 18 months for police to link the crime with the serial killer, and then in 1999 he was finally brought to justice. She was in the witness box of his trial that resulted in a lethal injection verdict that was carried out in June of 2006. From that attack to his capture, there were 9 more killings in between, potentially even more. His final words were a plea for forgiveness. I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I just ask you to forgive me and ask the Lord to forgive me for allowing the devil to deceive me. I thank God for having patience in me. I don't deserve to cause you pain, and you do not deserve this. I deserve what I am getting. Those were his final words before the lethal injection. The next serial killer is Andres Mendoza, born November 1947. He is a serial killer and a butcher, which plays into the allegations that he was also a cannibal, accused of a minimum of 19 deaths and up to 30 deaths, if not more. The reason it goes up to 30 is that in 2021, over 3,000 bones were found in his home. In 2022, once he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, the number of bones had grown to 4,600. So it is believed he has killed more than 30 people. In 2015, he was president of a citizens' council in his neighborhood. So by a lot of people's standards, he was a decent enough person. I say this because he was also supposedly very sexist. And this is what he was more known by. So everyone knew that he was just like a misogynist. But other than that, he was, on the city council. He was helping his neighborhood out. They didn't have any reason to believe this. Supposedly, he was inspired by the movie Silence of the Lambs. At least that's what the rumors. That's what the rumors were. A psychologist later interviewed him, and he said and he confirmed that he watched movies, but only Mexican movies. So that takes that theory off the table. At the age of 72, he was arrested at his home after an officer's wife went missing. A mother of 2 had been reported missing by her husband after going to Andres' house to get her parts to fix cell phones. That was her side business, and he had been supplying her with parts for a while. After failing to come home that day, Bruno Portillo went over to ask Mendoza some questions. After not letting him in, he became suspicious and returned with officers to gain access to his home. After a quick search, the police had found a secret basement where a table was placed that was soaked in the blood of his wife. Upon examination, the police discovered that he stabbed Bruno's wife in the chest multiple times and proceeded to process her body as if it were just a piece of meat. Later on, forensics teams would discover IDs, voter cards, and more belongings that could identify at least 19 victims. This suggested that he had been doing this for decades. Then they also found a diary and videos. Some were in films, like 8mm film. Others were in a VHS format. In this diary, he had 29 names written down. Police feared this may be the true number of victims, but there was not enough evidence. The videos were graphic and showed him peeling the flesh from his victims, with him being quoted as saying he removed her skin because she was pretty. Telling police that he normally met his victims in bars and that if they rejected him, that would be their fate. He has only confessed to killing 5 women: Flor Nieves Vizcaño Mejia, a single mother of 2 children who was working as a hostess in, I'm going to butcher this, Tlalnepantla, where she went missing in late 2016. And then Rubiciela Gallegos Castillo, a single mother of one from Monterrey, Nuevo León, who had been working as an Uber Eats driver in the same area and went missing in the summer of 2019. And then Norma Jimenez Carrion, who disappeared from Tlalnepantla in 2011. Berenice Sanchez Olivera, a young bar worker, and two other women known only as Ellen and Gardenia, whom he met at a local bar and allegedly murdered after being rejected. I have a few more on my list of serial killers. The next one is a little short due to the time frame. Again, the further back, the less is known about them, especially in Mexico. This guy's name is Gregorio Cadenas Hernandez, known as the Tacuba Strangler. He was a celebrity serial killer. Not that he killed celebrities, but he was a celebrity because of serial killer. With his case being the first spread by the media. Born in Mexico City as a child, he showed abnormal behavior due to childhood illness, including animal abuse and cruelty. So he was sick as a child, and this led to him just being a little off. Off enough to where people were like, that's what leads to being a serial killer. At the age of 15, he began visiting prostitutes because he believed he would never find love due to his chronic bedwetting. He did eventually get married, but that did not last long. She told his secret about the bedwetting, and he lost all respect for women. His murder spree just lasted about 2 months, maybe 2-3 months, not years like the other ones. So, on August 15th, 1942, a prostitute visited his house, a 16-year-old Maria de los Angeles. After they had relations, he then strangled her and buried her in his garden. In the following weeks, 2 more prostitutes were murdered, and then his 19-year-old classmate, that's number 4 right there. That's 4 murders in the span of just weeks. This arose the suspicion of neighbors who had called the police. After the bodies were exhumed, he placed himself into a mental institute where he was arrested on September 7th, 1942. So from August to September, that's when he was arrested. He escaped prison in 1947, but was later apprehended. Sentenced to life in prison, he studied law and psychiatry, wrote books, and learned to play the piano. While he was in prison, there was also a copycat killer out there, and an adult movie was made after his crimes, which was deemed illegal. So the movie was taken off shelves, destroyed, never to be seen in the light of day again. He eventually married and had 4 children. Then in 1976, he was pardoned by the president, was invited to give a speech to Congress where he was celebrated as a hero due to his rehabilitation. Afterwards, he opened a law practice where he worked to his death in 1999. So that was a surprising twist in the end there. So he killed 4 people back to back really quick. Realized he had an issue, went to a mental institute, got arrested, studied law, psychiatry, had kids, got married, had kids, and then became a lawyer. So who knows, like people in Mexico, wherever he lived, because it doesn't say where he lived afterwards, all the way up until 1999. Can you imagine being represented and not knowing that your lawyer is a former serial killer? I don't think they have to disclose that, but that'd just be kind of shocking. I'd be like, you do what now? Whatever you say is what we're going to do. I don't want to invoke your wrath right now. The previous killer shows that there is some redemption for people while others are just monsters. That's also Mexico's official position on a death penalty. They believe that death solves nothing. Yeah, so Mexico's strong belief is that lethal injection is not the way to go. Capital murder, capital crimes do not warrant a death penalty. They warrant a life sentence for a chance of rehabilitation. That's also what they wanted for the railway killer, since he was a Mexican citizen. They tried to appeal and have him taken to Mexico because, again, they did not believe this. And there's some details about the railway killer that I left out, like It took a Texas Ranger, an FBI agent, and a spiritual consultant to bring him in, under the guise that the Texas Ranger told him that he would not face the death penalty. So his family objected heavily to this because he was lied to. So it was just a lot of things going on. The next killer challenges that, though, with his sentence being over 200 years, Oscar Garcia Guzman, or as he was known as, the Monster of Toluca. Now, I believe that if you have a sentence of over 200 years, maybe the death penalty should be done, because it's a death sentence either way, because you're not getting out. Not much is known about his upbringing again, though it is believed that his father was abusive to his mother. He cared not for human life, for the idea of death and murder fascinated him since an early age. The only thing he cared for was his pets. He saw himself as a protector to his animals. He expressed concern for their well-being when he was in jail, often asking officials to treat his pets well and to ensure that they went to good homes. So he didn't care about human life, but he cared about he had 2 dogs and a few cats. He cared about his animals. Therapists saw this behavior as a sign of pathological narcissist because he can fulfill a need to have power over a being's well-being without any resistance. It's believed to be a psychopath and a narcissist who is eager for attention. So that's the best way to get attention. You have pets, you have cats, you have something that relies on you. You are their sole protector. He cared more about them than he cared about human life. This was proven because he murdered, he killed. But when he left, I'll get on to this later on, but still, it's just one of those tangents where he proved that this is what he cared more about. His hobbies included Krav Maga, listening to death metal, and Satanism. That's just a nice set of skills, right? I know there's a lot of people that say this will play into the satanic panic of the 90s, but this was after the 90s. This was in the early 2000s. Well, that's what it was. These hobbies have nothing to do with the way he was. It was mentioned as a correlation to his behavior. Hold on a second. They're just barking to bark. It was mentioned as a correlation to his behavior. So just because they're trying to piece together. Mexico is one of those countries where if you have certain activities that you do, it is thought that you're a satanic, that you're not a good person, blah, 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 right? So these were the correlations that they were drawing. Now, this next part might put the true crime community in the spotlight. He enjoyed stories about serial killers. So he enjoyed basically what we're doing here, listening to these stories of these serial killers. He admired them for their intelligence. His first victim was his own father at the age of 16. He confessed this to his mother during a phone call and then later to officials who were able to determine that it was true, though details of his father's death were never disclosed to the public. Murders 2 and 3 were a father and daughter he had met. He had met the daughter at a high school and became enamored with her so much so that he began to stalk her. One day, he broke into her house and began going through her belongings, not knowing that her dad was there. When he was confronted, he killed the dad, stabbed him, and left his body there while he waited for the girl to arrive. Once she got there, he overpowered her and took her home with him, where he kept her there for 2 weeks and assaulted her daily, and eventually he beat her to death, cut her up, put her body in a box, and dumped her in a ravine. And this all happened just 2 days before her birthday. Murder number 4 was a 27-year-old psychology student who had presented him as her boyfriend to her family at a gathering. She later went missing and was supposedly kept alive until February 2018. She went missing in March of 2017. That's a whole year. Number 5 had confessed to family members that she was scared due to feeling as if someone was stalking her, primarily the driver of a black truck. This victim was thought to have happened because he was neighbors with her mom, kept alive in a drug-induced stupor for days before her death. His final murder was another student of psychology who had gone missing October 24th, 2019. Her family had their suspicions of Guzman and had gone to his home multiple times to confront him, He had threatened them to stop harassing him. They had gone to the police to ask for assistance, but they could not help due to the lack of evidence. Eventually, they acquired a search warrant, which was done on October 30th. Upon entering his house, they found the strangled body of hers, having been murdered just hours before they went in. Once on the run, he taunted authorities due to their failure to stop him and threatened to continue killing if his pets were not returned to him or taken care of properly. Finally captured on December 6th at a music festival because he accessed public Wi-Fi. So because he accessed the public Wi-Fi, they were able to track him down. For his crimes, he received 217 years. His first 3 convictions got him 91 years, but after admitting to more murders, that drove his numbers up. So he got 91 years, but he kept confessing, he kept saying what he'd done, and that just kept bringing his numbers up to over 217 years. Now, the final member of this list is the cannibal of Chihuahua, Gilberto Ortega. Now, this guy is a true animal, is a true beast, is a true serial killer. He is depraved. This is one of the darkest ones I've read so far. Give me 1 second. I had to must turn it down again. So, Gilberto Ortega, believed to have murdered more than 30 people. This man has many names. He was also known as the Come Niños, which in Spanish means the kid eater. Since most of his victims were minors, born in 1969 from Chihuahua, Mexico, raised in Washington State in the United States, later moving to Mexico. He has siblings that lived in the United States. His father was in the Mexican army as a captain and born out of wedlock. Standing at 6'2", he was an imposing man. So he was a big guy. So his quick history. He lived in Mexico, but he was born in the States, lived in Washington, went back to Mexico. No, he was born in Mexico, raised in Washington State, and then went back to Mexico as an adult. And he was just a big man. He served in the military for 3 years, and then upon leaving the military, became a police officer for 4 years, which led him to be proficient with weapons. He entered politics shortly after he left the police force. But he entered politics because supposedly this was how he got close to his first victim. His first victim was an 11-year-old who worked as part of the campaign trail. He did everything to gain the trust of the young man. Upon doing so, he invited him on a car ride. Once outside of town, now warning, it gets graphic. I'm not going to go into full details, but just this part is too much. Once outside of town, he proceeded to tie the child up to a tree by his hands and his feet to his car and proceeded to rip the child apart, watching as his body ripped in half. When his parents got worried, he joined the search party and became close with the parents and told them whatever he could to get their confidence so they would not suspect that it was him that committed the murder. Someone did come forward and said that they had seen the two together, but it wasn't taken into consideration because he was seen as a good guy. So again, he gained everyone's confidence. So whenever they're like, oh, the last person to see him was Ortega, and they're like, oh, but he would never do anything like this. That's not him. So they dismissed it. Shortly thereafter, he committed his second murder, this time a 13-year-old that was his neighbor. Again, he took the child out of town and this time proceeded to try and abuse the child. The child put up a fight. So he shot him in the head 4 times. Eventually, police did investigate Ortega. Upon interviewing him, he confessed to the murders and to supposedly cannibalizing them and 30 other victims. He would tell his victims what he planned to do to them because he enjoyed the look that they gave him. The fear and panic, it was what made him excited. He also stated that he did the crimes because his imaginary friend that he had had since he was 4 years old told him to do so. He was only charged with 2 victims, as those were the only ones that could be proven. He was later thought to be schizophrenic, so the other 28 victims could have just been a hallucination. While in a high security prison serving a 75-year life sentence or a 75-year sentence, he admitted to being abused himself as a child in the USA by his uncles, who he later killed. None of this was able to be proven, so there was no documentation, there was no proof that his uncles were murdered by him, there was nothing that said that this was true. He has since stated that if able to be allowed out, he would kill again because he was not in charge, but his imaginary friend was. He also stated that Silence of the Lambs is what inspired him. In 2021, he was tied to a crime that was committed in 1995. But the details are not available if it was truly him or not. So there's nothing that tied him to this. It was just like, we believe he was a part of this crime. We don't have any other proof other than that's what we've been able to gather. So with that wraps up the dark side of serial killers. And I know there is no light side of serial killers, but this was like, the last two were truly dark and disturbed individuals. Most of them are truly disturbed individuals, with only one being rehabilitated into a normal lifestyle. So let's do a wrap up. The railway killer killed 30 plus people, was eventually caught because of one survivor. Another serial killer killed 4 or 5 people, got caught, became a lawyer, got out, got expunged by the government, and became a lawyer. And then the other 2 after that were just sick, depraved individuals that just killed and murdered, because that's what they did. There's no other recap other than that. So, thank you for listening. This has been Spooky Mysteries, Season 3, Episode 2. And I'll see y'all next time. So, until then, stay spooky, everybody. Later.
In this episode, we dive deep into the dark world of serial killers in Mexico. We discuss notorious figures, their methods, and the motivations behind their chilling actions, concluding with reflections on evil and the complexities of rehabilitation for such criminals.